want to talk today about a gentleman named William Pratt. And William Pratt, as we go through the presentation and talk about him, you'll get to know him. But he's a son of New England. He grew up in Connecticut, and he fought in the Second World War. And I learned about Willie as I was researching a project about the 82nd Airborne Division. And so as we talk today, you guys probably sat through a lot of presentations. You talk to people with PhDs or MDs or JDs. My credential is a library card. I'm not an academic. I'm not going to be giving an erudite presentation. We are just going to talk about Willie and the 82nd Airborne Division. I'm really excited to be here as we start getting into the narrative. I will apologize if I start speaking a little Army lingo, or if I get too excited or get a little salty. Mom, if the language gets a little rough, I apologize. I'll try to rein it in. So but this is a story of the U.S. Army in microcosm. And when the war started, our country had a prolonged period of peace after the First World War. We had a very small professional army, and it had to grow over time, and it grew exponentially over time. And it took leaders like Willie Pratt to ensure that young men who volunteered or were drafted by their country to fight and be part of that army and serve the nation around the world. Men like Willie were charged with training them, protecting them, and leading them in combat. So this is a story about the growth of the U.S. Army, but it's also about Willie's growth as well. Hey Jay, come on in, man.
How do you want to say?
Yeah, we're good to go. Thank you so much. Right on time, Jay. Thanks for coming.
We've been waiting for you.
Thank you. So this is go back one slide real quick. I think this is just a cool picture. So Willie spent the bulk of his time during World War II as what's called a battery commander. A battery is a small unit, and the infantry is called a company, and the cavalry they might call it a troop. It's anywhere from like 85 to 136 guys. In today's army, guys would refer to men and women, but back then it was still a gender-separated army, and it was guys. Willie had about 85 guys working for him in what was C Battery, Charlie Battery, of the 80th Airborne Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. So what was the 80th Airborne Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion? So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. This is the agenda we're going to go through, which runs through Willie's growing up in New England, how he joined the Airborne, where he went all over the world, from North Africa through the Mediterranean, Sicily, Italy, into Northern Europe. He was in England staging for D-Day. He fought in France, he fought in Holland, he fought in Belgium, he fought all the way through to the end of the war. And spoiler alert, Willie makes it. So, I want everybody to know about that. So one of the things I think is really cool about Willie, like I said, he's from Connecticut. I'm a Massachusetts guy. I really like being a New Englander. And he was not a professional soldier. So I was a professional soldier. That's what I did for 24 years. I've got two new best friends, Sean and Katie, who are also former professional soldiers and members of the 82nd Airborne Division. You guys are my ringers, so anytime I get wrong, just come on in and answer the questions. But Willie was, went to college, class of 36, then was Connecticut State College, today is UConn. He majored in dairy manufacturing. He had grown up the son of, let's see if I remember their names here, David and Ada, who was his parents. He had one sister, Jane, who actually married a gentleman named Martin, who was a navigator for the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II. And he also had a brother, Randall, who was in the United States Military Academy class of 1944. He actually graduated on D-Day, and he eventually became a colonel in the Army. But Willie was the oldest, and he majored in dairy manufacturing. And he also participated in Greek life. He was the vice president's fraternity. He also did ROTC, the Reserve Officers Training Corps. When he graduated in 1936, he got a commission in the United States Army Reserve, and really didn't think much of it. He did his drills, 2 weeks in the summer. He'd probably go down to the drill hall every week, take care of his friends and neighbors who were enlisted members of his unit. But it was not a big part of his life. He was working for General Motors. He was a young man in a hurry. I love that picture of him. He looks like he's out to make his first $1 million. So.
It's true.
But at this time, things are happening around the world. 1936, that's when Germany was kind of on the march. They reoccupied the Rhineland. They were expanding through 1938, 1939. The Anschluss in Austria. They take the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. In 1st of September 1939, they invade Poland, which a lot of people widely consider the start of World War II. At the same time, the Japanese had been operating in China since 1937. So a lot of things are happening around the world. At the time, the active Army of the United States was less than 175,000 enlisted men, and not many officers, less than 180,000 total. Current status of the U.S. Army is probably somewhere around 450,000 active duty, with an additional 600,000 or so in the Reserves and National Guard, and if you factor in Marine Corps, etc., we have probably just north of about 1 million men and women who could be called upon to serve today or either actively serving. Back then, we were much smaller. So this gentleman right here is a guy named, anybody know? Marshall. Yep, exactly, George C. Marshall. He's the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, starting on the 1st of July, 1939. His first report to Congress, he outlined the Army was small, there was no appropriations for training, and had the status befitting a third-rate power. By 1943, under Marshall's leadership, the Army had grown to 7 million ground troops, not counting the Army Air Force. The Air Force was not a separate service at the time, but 7 million ground troops operating in theaters worldwide, equipped with the best equipment and weapons and leadership that our country could provide. As I said, Marshall provided that vision, he provided that leadership, but it's guys like William Pratt who made that happen, who executed his vision and got that done. So how did they get that done? I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. Here we go. So this is Willie when he's training back in around 1936 when he's a brand new second lieutenant. The picture on the left is a machine gun battalion that was trained to go to France in 1918. As you can tell, there's not much difference between how Willie is dressed in 1936 and how things looked 20 years before. And that was kind of the status of the Army at that point. So he had to, when he came on active duty, help that Army modernize, train troops on that new equipment, and then take them overseas to fight. When 1940 comes, and he's what's called federalized. Federalized means I'm an Army Reserve guy, I do my day job, the president calls my unit up, and now I'm a full-time soldier. So his unit, the 304th Infantry, was federalized. They were formed part of what was called the 77th Infantry Division. However, he didn't stay with the 304th very long. He was called upon to be what was called a cadre for our new division that was forming, the 82nd Infantry Division. The 82nd Infantry Division had been a division during the First World War, had a very illustrious history. It's probably its most famous alumni from them was a guy named Sergeant Alvin York. He won the Medal of Honor on the 8th of October, 1918. I got married on the 8th of October, 1994. I picked that date so I'd remember because he got a Medal of Honor. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Willie gets his orders to leave the 304th and he reports to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, where the 82nd is forming up. And he becomes part of the 322nd Infantry Regiment. Eventually, he's going to take command of C Battery of the 80th AAA Battalion. They're going to get advanced training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and eventually they're going to be trained to insert into combating gliders. Now, why were they trained to insert into combating gliders? Because the Army was going to this doctrine of airborne troops that they borrowed from the Germans, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But Willie's first job was to turn civilians into soldiers, and the way he did that was he was in charge of the basic training for his company of soldiers in the 326. Today, when a soldier joins the Army, they'll go to basic training in a basic training unit, they'll get their job, do advanced training at other posts, and then they'll report to a unit. And that unit will already be filled with trained soldiers, and he'll fall in on their training schedule, she'll fall in on that training schedule, and they'll become an integrated part of that unit. In 1942, when soldiers reported to Camp Claiborne, all there was a skeleton crew of leadership, guys like Willie, other officers and NCOs, and they got a whole company of troops, brand new civilians fresh off the street. They took them through 13 weeks of basic training, then started taking them through their advanced individual training. Between March and August of 1942, that's exactly what Willie did. They were forming this great infantry division. And what happened was, while all that was going on, this new concept was emerging overseas, and the Germans were doing a fantastic job with it. And that new concept was something called vertical envelopment. And vertical envelopment is just airborne warfare. So the new concept was jumping on objectives from airplanes or bringing in heavier combat equipment via glider and taking objectives quickly because you can guard your flanks. Back then you couldn't, we didn't have missile technology. You couldn't easily guard from a coup de main from above. The Germans had tremendous success with that in the Low Countries in the invasion of Western Europe in 1940, both in Belgium and in the Netherlands. And the U.S. Army War Department was really, really excited about it. Hey, this seems like a good idea. So in 1940, they formed what's called a test platoon. 48 guys, teach them how to jump out of airplanes. They say, okay, these guys seem to take to it pretty well. They can recover themselves on the ground. They can operate as a unit. This is a good idea. Let's take this test concept and grow it up to be bigger. Pretty soon, the Army is now forming independent battalions and regiments of parachute troops. So a battalion, you take that company we talked about earlier, we'll assign 4 companies to that battalion. There'll be a headquarters unit, and back then 3 line companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, right? Excuse me, Able, Baker, and Charlie, to use 1940s terminology. And then a regiment would be 3 of those battalions. At first the idea was, well, we'll have these battalions be independent, we'll insert them behind enemy lines and they'll cause havoc and it'll be amazing. Then they're like, well, if we can do it with a battalion, we can do it with a regiment. But at the time, these units were considered independent, meaning that they would do short duration operations, they wouldn't go into combat for long term, and they had zero supporting infrastructure. So Katie was an intelligence officer, for example. They had an intelligence unit that could provide information on, hey, we think the enemy strength is this, we think their dispositions are this. None of that independent infrastructure was, or none of that supporting infrastructure was in any of these independent units at the time. But what happens is, this guy says, well, if we can make independent battalions and regiments, let's make them into divisions. So this guy's name is Leslie McNair, and he was Chief of Army Ground Forces in World War II. He's also one of the highest ranking guys to be killed during World War II. He was killed in Normandy in 1944 during the start of Operation Cobra by our own forces, accidentally in a bombing run. But at the time, he was like, hey, we're gonna make this Airborne Division. But the idea of the Airborne Division came after he came up with this concept of a triangular division. Let's go back to World War I for a second. A division was made up of several regiments. In World War I, they were called square regiments, square divisions, 4 regiments. The reason they used 4 regiments in World War I was, as you all may understand, big war of attrition, trench warfare, a lot of heavy casualties. Needed a lot of manpower to be very quickly pushed back into the line and make up losses. So they created these huge 4 regiment divisions. McNair wanted lighter, more maneuverable divisions. So he said, well, if we come down to a triangular one, 3, that's a lower span of control for leadership. He only has to deal with 3 regimental commanders. It'll be more maneuverable because they're not taking up as much road space, they're not taking up as much infrastructure. And also, if I take that 4th regiment from each of the square divisions, I can start building other divisions immediately. And even though I don't increase bottom line manpower, I have more big blocks on the board I can move around now. From that point, he's like, oh, now I've got this triangular division, I think I want to create airborne divisions, not just these independent striking forces of the regiments or battalions, but I want to be able to give these guys big infrastructure, give them big assignments, drop them behind enemy lines. They can seize and hold objectives like bridges, crossroads, power plants, etc., until they can link up with ground forces and just create another element of maneuver, give the enemy something else to think about. His vision for the Airborne Division was it would look like a triangular division, but it would be about half the size. It would be roughly 8,000 men. Whereas a standard division, it wasn't quite 16,000, but it was much bigger. His vision for Airborne was that they would have 2 glider regiments and 1 parachute regiment at the time. Question is, well, what about tanks? What are we gonna do about enemy tanks? So at the time, between the end of World War I and all through World War II, the idea was tanks are always gonna accompany infantry. They're a supporting arm, they don't do things on their own. The way you fight a tank is with a light mobile anti-tank gun that infantry can carry along with them. So the standard anti-tank gun at the time was a 37mm gun. But at the time all these things are kicking loose and we see, the Germans dropping into the Low Countries and they're taking Poland and they're moving all around Europe. This concept of armored warfare, lightning warfare is taking place and people are really shocked and like, we need a different anti-tank doctrine. McNair came up with an idea about, okay, we're gonna form what's called tank destroyer units. They won't be assigned to the individual division level. They'll be pooled at higher levels of headquarters. They'll be mobile, they'll be armored, they'll have heavy cannons, and we'll send them where they're needed on the battlefield to support the divisions. That way each division can look identical, they can worry about their own supply, we can supply them identically, and we can hold these special assets at a higher level. But then they're like, well, these airborne guys that you're gonna jump behind the lines, what are we gonna do about them? We can't give them a pooled asset. They gotta bring everything with them. So McNair's like, okay, we'll make the Airborne Divisions a little special. We're gonna give them their own anti-tank assets. And they decided on those 37mm guns we talked about earlier. Those are the guns they're gonna take with them via glider into combat. The next question was, well, where are these guys gonna come from? We don't have any additional troops that we can assign to these airborne divisions. So McNair came up with the idea of, well, we'll take the anti-aircraft battalion that is assigned to the division already, cut it in half of it's gonna be anti-tank now, the other half is going to be anti-aircraft artillery. And we'll man it with gunners from the infantry regiments. So that was what was McNair's big plan. And that's how we wound up with the 80th Airborne Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. It's activated in September 1942. As I stated, half of the batteries of 85 men each will fight tanks and half will provide air defense to the 82nd Infantry Division at the time. And they're going to go into combat via glider. This is roughly what it looked like. This is the overarching headquarters. It had a supporting headquarters battery that had medics, communications, a motor pool for their wheeled vehicles. It had these 3 batteries of anti-aircraft weapons and these 3 batteries of anti-tank weapons. Willie Pratt took command of C battery, which was had 8 37mm anti-tank guns. So Willie has his hands full because he's an infantry guy. And they said, hey Willie, you're not gonna lead infantry anymore. You're gonna lead this anti-tank unit. So okay, I can handle that. All the guys who are assigned to him are pulled from other units. They were assigned to regiments, infantry regiments that were already part of the 82nd Division that they'd just gone through these 13 weeks of training with. They bonded with their buddies. Now we're gonna pull some of you and we're gonna give you to Willie Pratt, and you guys aren't infantry anymore. You're now coast artillery gunners and you're gonna learn how to fight with this anti-tank cannon. Okay, so taking me away from my buddies, you're giving me a different job, and oh, by the way, I gotta fly into combat in a glider, and I don't have any choice about it. You're not asking me to volunteer, you're saying this is your new way to go into combat. So Willie has to train these guys on new doctrine, merge them as a team, and get them over the fact that their first airplane ride is gonna be in a glider that is a controlled crash when it lands. So he's kind of a busy guy. This is the aircraft that the men were going to take into combat, the CG-4A Waco glider. Not made in Waco, Texas, by the way. The Waco Glider Company was, that just happened to be the name of it, and it was the standard glider in which the 80th trained in North Carolina at Laurinburg-Maxton Air Force Base, or Air Corps Base at the time. You could put 13 troops in it, or you could put 1 cannon or 1 Jeep in it. So it took several of these gliders to get them into combat. It had a plywood frame stretched with fabric over it, and there was a metal reinforcement to keep it from breaking apart on landing. That metal reinforcement is going to become very important as we get further along in the discussion. Biggest challenges of being a glider guy. You got told you have to do it. You don't get any extra money for it, and you don't get any distinctive uniform items. This becomes a big deal. So show of hands, who's seen Band of Brothers? All right, so we all know they got the shiny jump boots, they've got the jump wings, they get 50 extra bucks a month. The officers were getting 100 back then. These guys weren't getting any jump pay, no hazardous duty pay. They didn't get any flight pay like the pilots of the gliders. They weren't authorized any special accoutrement. They did not get to wear, they got to wear the 82nd Airborne patch. They got to wear a little glider patch on their hat. They didn't get to wear the special boots, did not have a special badge, didn't have a special jump uniform. And they were treated as second-class citizens by the parachutists in the division. Things got a little more difficult for them too, because that concept, hey, we're gonna have 2 glider regiments and 1 parachute regiment, the idea was, hey, these glider guys aren't working out the way we want them to. We're still gonna hang on to 1 glider infantry regiment, all the heavy stuff's still gonna go in glider, but we're gonna have 2 parachute regiments now. So the 82nd got 2 independent regiments, the 505th and the 504th. They merged with the rest of the 82nd at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in the fall of 1942, trained up with them through the spring of 1943. And these guys thought that they were the cocks of the walk. And they took every opportunity that they had to make the glider guys feel not so special. And that created a lot of resentment. So, again, changed my job on me, making me go into combat in the glider, and these new guys who just showed up are treating me like I'm with the Johnny-come-lately. So it was a rough leadership challenge for Willie. In the spring of 1943, the 82nd Airborne Division gets its warning order to go fight in Europe. But they initially wind up going to North Africa. Jumping back a little bit, in the fall of 1942, Operation Torch is when the Allies invade Western Africa, at Casablanca, at Oran, and Algiers. You've seen it in the movie Patton, they come ashore, all that kind of stuff. They quickly move east, and then they participate in the taking of Tunisia, and by the spring of 1943, they linked up with the British, moving from east to west, and they've driven the Nazis out of North Africa. Big question is, what are we gonna do next? US wants to immediately invade Germany. Cross the channel, go into France, drive through France, take Germany. The UK, led by Prime Minister Churchill, is like, well, let's take a look at the soft underbelly of Europe. Maybe we can hit Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, drive up Italy, and drive through the vitals of Europe and take Germany from the south. Eventually, the plans decided upon is the next operation is they're going to take Sicily. And from Sicily, the 82nd will then participate in operations in Italy. But the first thing that happens when Willie and the boys get to North Africa is they find out that 37mm guns are useless. They cannot penetrate the armor on any German tank, the Mark III, the Mark IV, it's too thick. They spend time with a British unit and learn how to fight tanks in the desert. And the first thing they determined is, well, we gotta get rid of the 37mm guns. The commander of the battalion, a guy named Raymond Singleton, and we'll talk about him a little bit more later, arranges to get a total of 18 guns from the British. They're not quite the 57mm gun that these guys are gonna use later. It's what's called a British 6-pounder. 6-pounder is the size of the shell, but it's roughly a 57mm gun. The good thing about it is it has a very narrow wheelbase. You can put it on a glider. Ben, why did they give these guys 37mm cannons instead of American 57mm cannons? That's a great question. The reason they did it was the wheelbase on the standard 57mm cannon at the time could not fit on a Waco glider. So they went to combat with the equipment that they had. They get there, they find out it's useless, the British hook them up. The problem is though, it's supposed to have 24 cannons. We've only got 18. So Singleton tells his battery commanders, to include Willie Pratt, okay, you guys get 6 guns each, you can arrange them how you want. The able battery commander says, I'm gonna keep my structure the way it is. They have 2 gun sections, 3 and 3. The Baker battery commander's like, hey, I want more flexibility. I'm gonna create a 2-2-2 configuration. Willie does this creative thing that I absolutely love. Never got to prove it in combat, but I think it was the right thing to do. He kept his platoon structure of 2 platoons, gave 1 platoon 4 and 1 platoon 2. 4 was his heavy guys. They were gonna be the main line of defense supporting whoever needed anti-tank support. And his mobility was gonna come from those other 2. So it gave him maximum tactical flexibility. And this is the first sign that we're gonna see that Willie is a very creative commander in combat. Never got to fight in that configuration because there's no fighting going on in North Africa. The Germans have already left. We're getting ready to go into Sicily. So just for comparison, that's the little 37mm gun, that's the 6-pounder. Just by looking at it, you can see the capability. This is a really cool schematic of a 57mm that a good buddy of mine made. The thing I wanted you guys to take away from this though is the armor penetration it's capable of. It can penetrate up to 3.77 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. 1,000 yards when you're dealing with this type of firepower is not very long, even though it's 10 football fields. The engagements these guys are gonna fight at are gonna be at much shorter distances though. I gotta pick up the pace a little bit. So these guys are gonna go into Sicily and then eventually Italy. Sicily takes place in July 1944. The concept is they're gonna drop 2 parachute infantry regiments, one after the other, one night, the second night, and then they're gonna land the glider infantry and supporting glider stuff on the 3rd night. They drop the parachute infantry in on the 1st night, they're widely scattered, but they're able to form up a defense at a place called Piazza Ridge, which is protecting the landing beaches where the rest of the Allied troops are planning to land to take Sicily. Plan is to reinforce them on the 2nd night with the 2nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. That drop goes terribly. The reason it goes terribly is all the supporting naval ships were expecting an air raid from the enemy. They were told not to fire. Some nervous gunner saw the American aircraft approaching over the fleet, decided to open fire. Everybody else opened fire. So it wreaked havoc on the 2nd Parachute Infantry Regiment that was going to go into combat in Sicily in support of the 82nd. The general commanding the division, a guy named General Matthew Ridgway, made the determination no more aircraft are going into Sicily because of this friendly fire incident. So the 325 and all the supporting stuff, to include Willie's battery, go into Sicily by boat. The reason this is really important is their guns did not get to Sicily in time to make a difference. The German division called the Hermann Göring Division, which was manned by tankers, launched a massive counterattack on the beachhead in the American sector in Sicily. They were held off by the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which my friend Sean is an alumni of. But the 505th had no heavy equipment to fight tanks with because it was all sitting back waiting to get loaded on gliders. It did not go in the initial wave. These guys had to fight with bazookas, rifle grenades, and anything else they could get their hands on. It's a heroic defense, and it is vivid in the annals of the 82nd Airborne history, but it was also a tremendous waste of manpower. If the equipment that was supposed to fight tanks got into the battle early enough, it would have made a decisive difference. Once Sicily is taken, the next decision is, what are we gonna do? They decide to reinforce success and invade Italy. There's an operation called Giant 2, which was this idea, well, hey, the Italians are getting ready to give up. They don't want to fight for the Germans anymore, so let's drop an airborne division on Rome and knock them out of the war. And so the 80th is getting all geared up to fly their gliders into Rome. General Ridgway thinks this is a really dumb idea because there's no Allied presence except in the very southern part of Italy. Go back quick. They're all hanging up down here. A lot of Germans up here, and they want to drop one division all by itself up here to take Rome. He sends his assistant division commander, a guy named Max Taylor. to do a reconnaissance on the ground. So Taylor goes behind enemy lines, and he meets with leadership from the Italian government, and they're like, yeah, we can't guarantee your safety if you jump in here. This is ridiculous. So they decide to scrap that mission. Instead, the decision is made to land an invasion force at a place called Salerno. The 80th goes in support of that operation at Salerno. Able, Baker, and Charlie batteries don't get into that fight either. They've been geared up to go into Rome, and they were sitting back in Sicily, ready to fly their gliders in. They got told to stand down. D, E, and F batteries, the air defenders, did make it into Italy. They fought as part of a group called Task Force Ranger, and they fought very valiantly. Eventually, the anti-tank guns made it into Italy, but at that point, the Germans had already retreated north, so very little combat is seen at that point. They wind up occupying Naples and acting as an occupying force in Naples until they're pulled out in late 1943 to go prepare for the invasion of Europe, invasion of France. Initially, they go to Ireland, and by the spring, or the early winter, spring of 1944, they're in England preparing to go into Normandy. So this is Ray Singleton, the guy I told you guys about before. Singleton decided, hey, we gotta change how we do business. Number one, if paratroops are dropping in, we're sending anti-tank guns with them immediately. That's thing one. Refuse to listen to anything else because they have to be able to fight tanks immediately once they're on the ground. Number two, the way they were fighting in Sicily was you took a battery and you gave it to a regimental commander of an infantry unit, and he kept it. Whether he was fighting anything or not, he considered that his now. Singleton wants to pool the batteries. I'm going to give you a battery to support you when you need it. You don't need any more. I'm pulling it back and I'm giving it to another guy. He insists on that as well. It's called operational control, or OPCON. Then lastly, he comes up with an idea that an anti-tank command post that manages all these assets has to go into the battle immediately as well. Singleton did not get to Sicily until almost a week after the paratroops jumped in. He was a non-entity as far as that fight went. He was like, in the future, I'm going to be on the ground immediately to take care of my batteries and leave my men. So they go into training for Normandy with that mindset. So this, we'll revisit this map in a minute, but this is where the stuff of instant legend happened. This is Normandy, and this is basically the Gettysburg of the 82nd Airborne Division, to coin a term, or not to coin a term, to borrow a term coined by a gentleman named Colonel Keith Nightingale. So, I'm pretty sure everybody here knows D-Day was on the 6th of June 1944, the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe. The 82nd, they had a mission to drop on behind Utah Beach, seize and secure a town called St. Mary Glees, another one called Picaville, and another one called Amfreville. That was the mission, and they were going to secure bridgeheads over the Margaret River, prevent the Germans from counterattacking the beaches. 2 batteries went in very soon after the parachute drop that took place just after midnight on the 5th of June, 6th of June. They were A and B batteries. Willie was sitting back at Ramsbury Airfield, England. He did not get to go in until the evening of the 6th. I cannot imagine the tension this man was under, waiting all day, not only to enter his first big combat experience, but knowing his buddies were already fighting and he had assets they could use, and he had to wait to get into the fight. But this picture was taken by his battery XL, a guy named Marshall Stark, and this is the glider that he flew into combat in. And this is written on the back of that photo. And so they took a lot of fire going in when they eventually did land in Normandy. This picture was taken in flight by Marshall, and this is the horse and glider that was behind Willie in that previous picture. So this is Willie going into combat on the evening of 6th June. This looks a little bit different from that Waco glider we were talking about before. This is a horse and glider. It's a British glider. It's bigger, can hold more troops, can hold more equipment. It does not have a metal reinforcing cage. It's going to cause problems in a couple slides. Sorry about that, guys. So this is the routes the airborne, both the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions took into Normandy, landing right behind Utah Beach. This is the route that the gliders took in. I just think this is a very cool graphic. It also shows the Cherbourg Peninsula, because here are the invasion beaches right here. And what's gonna happen is Commonwealth troops, English troops, land on the eastern beaches. They eventually drive to Caen. They set up a big pivot and a big blocking force. The US troops land on the to the west. They drive across the Cherbourg Peninsula, cut off the port of Cherbourg, turn south, and eventually are going to sweep east and break out towards the Seine River. That's the big campaign plan. But a lot has to take place before that happens. So the initial drops were widely scattered. The best way to look at that is these circles indicate the drop zones that the troops were supposed to land on. The ones we're concerned with are here. The 82nd Airborne Division was plussed up with extra parachute infantry for Operation Neptune, which was the jump into Normandy. They had left one of their regiments fighting in Italy. They got out of Italy right before Normandy kicked off. They weren't equipped to go into combat again. They needed to reconfigure. So Ridgway got 2 additional regiments, the 507th and 508th. He had his veteran 505th. The 505th jumped in the vicinity of St. Mary Glees, the 507th near Amfreville, the 508th near Peekaville. If you imagine each of these circles, which are the drop zones, as targets, and each of these little dots here as a group of paratroopers, and they should all be landing inside the target, you can see how widely scattered they were. These indicate the drop zones of the 101st. They had similar problems. The 505th landed pretty close to their objectives near St. Mary Glees, and they very quickly became the main effort. As you can indicate here, the 82nd mission is to seize roads and bridges. There's a road network that runs through St. Mary Glees, a series of crossroads that the 505th secures. And also, the next slide will show it better. Along the Red River, there's a series of bridges. There's one down here at Shefta Point, there's one up here at Lafayette. Those bridges needed to be secured. If the 507th and 508th had taken their objectives, they would have been able to set up blocking positions west of the Margaret to stop the Germans. However, most of those widely scattered troopers wind up crossing the Margaret and linking up with other elements of the division around here at St. Mary Glees. So the first 96 hours is fighting for these bridges all along the Margaret and securing this crossroads around St. Mary Glees. The night of the 6th, there's a big battle going on here in the vicinity of Shefta Pont, which is one of those crossing points. Right about the time they decided they needed some artillery support, William Pratt and the boys from Sea Battery land on Landing Zone T, which is right here, and like magic, bring with them 4 anti-tank guns and set up and help defend Shefta Pont from counterattacking Germans, and they eventually take this bridge. By the 9th of June, everything's focused on the bridge here at Lafayette Causeway. Eventually, the 82nd manages to take all these points, push the Germans back. Troops coming from Utah Beach manage to cross over, and they continue to drive to the west to take, cut off Sherbrooke Peninsula, as I discussed earlier. They wind up staying in combat through the 9th of July. I'll give you a quick second to read this. Basically, it says Willie and the boys really kicked a lot of tail. They got a Presidential Unit Citation for their action fighting around St. Mary Glees as part of D-Day. I'm not going to make you all read the whole thing. I just think that's the coolest thing. And this is what their commander, General Ridgway, had to say about their fighting when they were pulled out of combat on the 9th of July. And this is where the glider guys, to include Willie and the boys, get respect. After Normandy, there's no glider paratrooper anymore. They're just airborne soldiers. Congress votes specialty pay for the glider riders. They get their own badge. Looks like the parachute badge, except there's a little glider on it. And they get to wear the jump boots that the paratroopers wear. So they all look the same, and they're all part of the team. So they train up to go back into combat with this newfound sense of experience, this newfound sense of camaraderie, and pretty soon they're told, hey, you guys are going to be jumping into Holland.
Oh.
This operation is called Operation Market Garden. The Allies, while the 82nd's been back in England, working on getting themselves reconstituted after combat, have been driving eastward. Very successful sweep through France. By September of 1944, though, their logistics lines are starting to get stretched. So logistics is becoming the big issue. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, wants to open up the port of Antwerp to help reinforce the logistics, because logistics are still coming over from the beach from all the way back in France. He wants his chief subordinate, General Montgomery, to take Antwerp. Monty's like, I got a better idea. We can end this war in 3 months if you allow me to do this drive through the heart of Holland, jump the Rhine, north of the German defenses, and we can knock them out of position. We can end the war by Christmas. Against his better judgment, I was like, okay, I'm going to go with it. We're going to allow you to do that mission to take it by Christmas. So, looks like my little point. There we go. So basically what has to happen is, this is what's called 30th Corps. It's a heavy armored unit from the British, made up of 3 divisions. They're going to drive 60 miles up this narrow front across a series of bridges that are taken from German defenses from Eindhoven to Nijmegen to Arnhem, jump the Rhine, outflank the Germans, cause them to fall back. That's the big plan. The Germans have a slightly different idea. I'm going to come back to that map in a second. On the 17th of September, the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, the British 1st Airborne Division jump into Holland. They've got to take a total of 9 bridges. 82nd's gotta take at least 6. So I wanna jump back up to that map and show you real quick. They have to take the bridge over the Moss River at Grave. They've gotta take 2 bridges over the Wall River up here in the city of Nijmegen. And they've gotta take 3 of these 4 across the Moss Canal. The one down here in Mook, or another one of these 4 up here. So they gotta have at least 6. They jump into this drop zone here, DZN. They have to secure the heights from German assaults. They have to protect this landing zone where their heavy artillery is gonna be coming in, and they eventually have to take these bridges. The plan is they're gonna be reinforced on the 18th by further drops and further heavy equipment coming in. And they're gonna fight to secure these bridges as that British 30th Corps coming north. As soon as these drops go in the 17th, the weather goes to crap. So Willie and the boys are stuck back in England. A lot of fierce fighting's taking place around here. These bridges are taken, but they're taken behind schedule. Eventually there's a break in the weather. Willie and the boys get in on or about the 23rd of September. The bridges that over the Nijmegen are taken. They were actually taken before Willie got there on the 20th. But the furthest bridge to the north couldn't hold. The British troops could not get to the paratroopers who took it. And so that division was basically destroyed, the 1st British Airborne Division. A lot of people taken prisoner by Germany, and the overall operation failed. The problem now is you got 2 other airborne divisions, the 101st and 82nd, are stuck in Holland because they have to hold the train they've already taken. They can't be pulled back to reconstitute. So by the 28th of September, this battle is basically over, but they're going to stay in position for over another month fighting the Germans because they're waiting for the ground troops to catch up with them and basically relieve them. They eventually get relieved in early November, go into a rest camp in France. But they're not resting very long because the Germans lost their counterattack. Raise your hands if you heard of the Battle of the Bulge. So the Germans called that mission Wacht am Rhein, which stands for Watch on the Rhine. And they basically counterattacked through the Ardennes forest and were driving for the port of Antwerp. They were gonna go through Liège and take the port of Antwerp. The idea was if they could crush the Allied logistics, they could force the Allies out of the war and turn all their attention to fighting the Soviets in the east. So the airborne guys who were in the camp when that German counterattack hit squarely on a U.S. unit called the 106th Infantry Division. Green unit, they fought valiantly, but they could not hold out against this massive German attack. So the airborne gets called in to shore them up. Initially, the 82nd and the 101st move out from France and wind up in Bastogne. But very soon, it's realized that a heavy penetration is coming in on what's called the Northern Soldier in the vicinity of a town called Webermont and another town called Tropon, or 3 Points. So the 82nd's moved up there to what's called the Northern Shoulder. This is what their dispositions wind up looking like. They put a regiment at 3 Points, another regiment down at Velsom, and then they refuse their flank along this line through here. So they're in a position like this from the 19th through the 24th of December. The big test comes at Short Point on the 21st of December. Big German attack across this river. And the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, is holding this location. They're mostly in positions behind the Somme River, but they've got one company forward, E Company. And E Company is reinforced by a section of A Battery. This doesn't have to do too much with Willie, but I want to show you the kind of men that Willie served with. This is what a 57mm in that type of train looks like. That's Lieutenant Jake Wertick. This is Lieutenant Stokes Taylor. On the 21st of December, during that fight at 3 Points, the Germans were encircling E Company, 2nd of the 505th, and they were driving them across the river. They were going to destroy that company, and they were going to destroy the guns that were forward of the river. Corporal Taylor, actually this is Corporal Taylor, I apologize. Corporal Taylor and Lieutenant Wertick volunteered to stay. Wertick operated an anti-tank gun by himself while getting protective covering fire from a Browning automatic rifle from Corporal Stokes Taylor, and they stayed in position. You hear that expression, this is the hill I choose to die on. This was the hill these guys chose to die on. They stayed in position, defended the retreating paratroopers, their other battery mates until they were killed. But that allowed them time to get back across the river and set up a new blocking position against the advancing Germans. Let me go back up to one on the map, and I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. The line stabilizes on the 24th of December. Decisions made to pull them back to make it to a more easily defensive line on the 26th. The German offensive basically peters out. On or about the 3rd of January, the Allies go back onto a counterattack. which is indicated by what I think is the coolest map that was in William Pratt's possession, right here. This shows all the positions of the anti-tank assets that were available to the 80th when that counterattack started. I think this actually represents the 6th of January. But at this point, Willie had been promoted from being a battery commander to being the operations officer of the battalion. So he was responsible for planning this anti-tank defense with a lot of those extra assets that come from corps level. So once the German counterattack is pushed back, we're almost towards the end of the war. From January to April 1945, the 82nd's on the advance against the Germans. They eventually link up with the Soviets as they cross the Elbe River, and they soon they start taking security operations take priority over combat operations. The German army has basically ceased to function by April 1945, so their mission is now to secure the local populace. While executing that mission, they discover Woblin concentration camp, which had been a camp for political prisoners. If anyone's seen the scene from the Band of Brothers where they liberated a concentration camp, it is horrific. It's probably more so horrific than HBO made it seem. And all the men of the 80th toured that camp to see what their enemy had been capable of right before the end of the war in Europe. Once the war was over, the men became occupation troops. They moved to Berlin, and they stayed as doing security operations and protecting the local populace, basically acting as a police force because the German National Police Force was defunct. And they stayed in Berlin until early 1946. Men with high points that you got points for how much time you spent in combat, whether you had children, whether you had combat decorations, they got to go home early. But most of even though he was a high point man, Willie decided to stay behind because he was one of the highest ranking men in the battalion. And eventually they all got home in January 1946, and there's Willie marching down Fifth Avenue as part of Victory Parade. And this is the decorations he received. I didn't get to it because I was going quickly. He was wounded in combat during Operation Market Garden on the 10th of October 1944. This indicates that he was federalized in 1940. This is his European Theater of Operations ribbon with arrowhead to show he participated in a combat assault, and 6 campaign stars. And the 2 stars on his glider wings indicate combat assaults into Normandy and into Holland. Well, he retired. He was married in, I want to say, the 12th of October 1946, raised 4 boys. Lived until, I want to say, let me check my notes real quick. Give me a second. It looks like September 6th, 1998. And he had a full life working for his family, and this is him shortly before he passed. And the last thing I want to do is, you might notice someone in the audience who looks a little bit older now, but looks very similar to this young man right here. And that's Mr. Joe Pratt, who's Willie's son, and his wife, Mickey. So that's the end of my presentation, guys. And I went faster. I thought I had more time than I did. I apologize for that, but I have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has.
Have any of the family or yourself traveled to the battlefields where he served? Or?
I'm going to say the short answer to that question is yes, and I got to walk the train at Normandy. However, I'm going to let Joe and Mickey answer that with a little more detail because they just came back from an awesome trip. They're getting ready to go on another one.
So, Mickey has been the really big push for this. She knew and loved my dad. So we just got back from Normandy. We went to Italy a couple of years ago, trying to see where he was there. And we're scheduled to actually go into Netherlands in a month from now, a little more, to see where he went over there. We went to Lafayette Bridge, which was a really, really great experience. And while we were there for the 80th. Jim Gavin's daughter was there and spoke, and then Ike's daughter was there and spoke as well while we were there. So it was, and then the 82nd Airborne, the head of the 82nd Airborne now, presently, was there. And then the 82nd Airborne, if you've ever watched them on TV, they're America's Got Talent. Maybe you've seen the chorus. They were there singing at Lafayette Bridge. So it was absolutely amazing.
Well, it's an incredible tribute to your loved one, and awesome presentation.
Yeah, it was a great presentation.
So if no one else has any other questions, that does end my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you.
When did you find out about all this?
Well, he he mentioned things growing up, but, you know, to us, he was just dad. You know, he came back and, like most of them, they came back and went back to work, you know? You know, he lived on a small farm, he worked for General Motors, and we had a pile of stuff, and Mickey is the one that really started to go through our boxes of material that we had. And then 2 years ago, I guess,
It's been 2 years.
that we found out this gentleman was writing a book on the 80th, and Mickey reached out to him, and, you know, he reached back, and so we were able to connect, and we learned so much through this, you know, this journey that we're on, that we never knew about that. I mean, you know, I knew he was in the 82nd Airborne, that's pretty much all I knew. But
He never told us that he was head of a battery. He never told us that he went on to be S3.
you know,
Riding gliders and all that.
yeah, I mean,
Never described it, never. I tried to, you know, I talked to him about it once, and he just didn't want to talk about it.
No.
But he kept it all. He kept it all, like everything he could. But he kept it quiet in his head and his heart.
but
Yes,
yes,
sir. Once again, thanks for the
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.